Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, more residents pushed back against assurances of safety, increasingly concerned about their long-term health and the chemical smells in the Alberton area during visits. We now continue with Part 1, Chapters 18 and 19. Chapter 18, Spikes. April 16. Transfer of Car 1 stopped at midnight and a wary night watch commenced. Marine Environmental recorded a direct reading of 14.3 parts per million on I-90, a dangerous level. Today, Marine first documented readouts from fixed stations, which told a common story of peaks rising and falling throughout the night into the morning, often at dangerous acute and chronic levels. After 7 a.m., Missoula Hazmat resumed direct readings around the tape barrier, with a hit greater than 20 parts per million, the monitor limit, at the north barrier. An hour later, readings quieted. The chlorine slept, only to stir fitfully. The techs had ambitious plans today to separate Car 4 from Car 3, then roll Car 3 to assess the rupture. Moving Car 3 would be extremely dangerous. The EPA would later say that according to MRL representatives, an estimated 64.8 tons of chlorine were released into the environment, and that most of this chlorine was released April 11. This left about 25 tons. By 9 a.m., the techs decided to leave Car 3 entirely alone until other cars were dealt with. Worst saved for last, but that meant ongoing assault from chlorine. Despite assurances yesterday of an April 24 reentry goal, Steve Way wrote this morning, "There is no clear schedule or projected completion date." Car 3 was the key. A cold front arriving after 1 p.m. from the west would bring a possible thunderstorm with erratic, gusty winds. Rain meant spikes. A mixed blessing, rain brought penetrating heat, yet absorbed some of the gas once airborne. Hulcher continued clearing the west end and the empty Car 5. However, they noted, the process of moving it stirred up the soil and freed some chlorine gas. A little rain also produced gas, and levels near Car 4 spiked to 80 parts per million. MRL's Dan Watts said at noon that spikes were causing some problems. As releases continued, Hazmat responded to monitoring requests in all directions outside the exclusion zone. No readings were logged. The techs planned to start transfer of Car 2 this afternoon, though they were still concerned about the structural integrity of Cars 2 and 4. Under pressure, these tanks were potentially more dangerous than Car 3. Facing uncertainty, Georgia Pacific came up with a new plan for Car 3. Rather than patching the car, they said, since nobody knows exactly where the holes are, the plan calls for building a berm around the car, which will minimize permeation. Moving Car 3 is too hazardous without knowing where the holes are. EPA's Way recalled, "We actually told them that they would not move the car while the chlorine was in it because that would likely potentially cause a very significant release event again. Ice would be loosened, and liquid chlorine sloshing about would instantly boil." The techs and EPA finally decided only one chlorine car had ruptured, and Watts told evacuees Car 3 caused the whole incident. Car 3, Way recalled, was that major problem staring at us. A rain bomb was coming. After 2 p.m., as the techs began transfer of Car 2, MRL reported rain falling and a vapor cloud rising from the site. Work stopped. The techs called it a very hard rainfall that lasted about 3 to 5 minutes. Then at 3:48 p.m., roadblock 4 at Sear reported 0.5 parts per million. They received no warning. If sustained, this would be a problem. Within a minute, a deputy at the roadblock advised that they were still getting chlorine readings up to 0.5 parts per million, and they prepared to retreat to Fish Creek. This event alone illustrated the risk, as Sawmill area residents had been left behind. IC instructed the crew to move west in half-mile increments, evacuating any residents in the vicinity. By 4 p.m., Missoula Hazmat brought another monitor, and it read even higher. People living up Fish Creek were now advised to evacuate. Hazmat reported high winds. Roadblock 4, now relocated to Fish Creek at exit 66, reported 0.5 to 1.4 parts per million and were again instructed to move west in half-mile increments. At 4:45 p.m., Roadblock 4 reported 0 parts per million less than a mile west of Fish Creek, about 8 miles from the spill site. 5 more residents were evacuated. The exclusion zone had moved 3.5 miles west due to strong adverse winds and detectable chlorine, the text said. Soon after, the monitor reported readings of 2.2 parts per million at a location unstated. The last positive off-site reading related to this event came at 7 p.m., over 3 hours since the first report. Chlorine had been galloping west. That evening, the text explained what happened. We had a very hard rainfall that lasted about 3 to 5 minutes. The water got into the intersection of cars 2, 3, and 4 and created a cloud, which looked like a grass fire. It quickly enveloped car 2. Suddenly, the wind changed, and the cloud moved westerly. If the cloud had headed east, forward ops would have needed quick evacuation, and likely the reopen area between Petty Creek and 9 Mile as well. Shortly after that, the text said, we received a call that the monitor at the Sear exit was reading 0.5 to 2.5 parts per million. By the log, the first reading at Sear was about 88 minutes after the rain began. There was no indication that the roadblock was warned of the impending gas. Elevated readings followed afterward for 3 hours, with a peak at Sear of a stout 2.5 parts per million. Roadblock 4 stayed at Fish Creek permanently, with the exclusion zone extended 3.5 miles west. No rationale was given for not expanding an equal distance to the east as a precautionary measure. Today's roadblock pullback and evacuations had scrambled. The east boundary remained 4.1 miles from the site, while the west boundary was now 7.2 miles. Winds predominantly came from the west, the reason the east boundary previously extended much further. If the winds had been from the west, IC would have had to re-evacuate as far as 9 Mile. Yet there had been no catastrophic release, just sudden rain, creating spikes from the soil. Another squall was forecast for 7:30 p.m. in half an hour. Lieutenant Mike McMeekin reported 2 spikes since 4:30 p.m., making at least 5 for the day, all apparently weather-related. The EPA reported the spikes were up and down in less than 5 minutes. Rain came, a gas blast followed. Car 3 continued to leak as well. What if the rain had come during resident visits? What if the wind had come from the west? While the story of the day had been the numerous spikes and another evacuation, the lead news in the April 17 Missoulian instead highlighted the inconvenience and safety risks of the 81-mile detour of I-90. A 3-sentence news brief mentioned that the west boundary of the evacuation zone was moved from Sear to Fish Creek Tuesday afternoon. It noted, a cold front, thunderstorms, and erratic winds increased officials' concern for the safety of residents in the western area. There was no mention of chlorine spikes or readings. The Missoulian never documented the several gas spikes of April 16. The news report made it appear that officials had been proactive in the expansion of the exclusion zone, when in fact elevated readings at Sear drove a scrambled fallback. Likewise, at the next day's evacuee meeting, Sergeant Dave Ball said, our roadblock to the west during the storm yesterday expanded a bit to Fish Creek, with no mention of the chlorine spikes. The health department was kept out of the loop on these spikes and the evacuation. Officials withheld information on the day's spikes. One result was that no resident questioned why the west boundary was expanded but not the east boundary. Staffing the Sear roadblock, Larry Price said the decision to pull back had been made by the crew despite some resistance from IC. We told them it was too bad and we were moving out. We didn't give a shit. And then finally they said, well, we'll find a place where it's safe. During the spike, Price said, we hooked up the trailer, took us 2-3 minutes, and we were gone. The crew had been issued no gas masks. They said we didn't need them. We brought our own SCBAs. Price had wanted to fall back further. It spiked that day, he said, and stayed up high for about 3 hours, 4 hours, then it went down a little bit. They said, we want you to set up at Fish Creek if you feel it's safe. I said, no, I don't feel it's safe. I think we should set up a Lozo and get everybody the hell out of here. And they said, well, we can't do that. Waldron denied that the roadblock crew initially got resistance from IC to allow the retreat from Sear. It didn't make any difference to us where that roadblock was, he said. That was Mineral County. But Waldron was lead incident commander. Mineral County wasn't even on the Unified Command, and what made a difference were more evacuations. By the logs, it was clear IC wanted to verify the Sear readings and had Hazmat send over another monitor, which read even higher. A little later, IC wanted to know if the person with the monitor can smell the chlorine and if his eyes are watering. as if questioning the need to pull back. In his daily report the next morning, EPA's Way wrote, "Rains have warmed up spilled or otherwise exposed material, causing the release of more chlorine from the site. Air monitoring has indicated concentrations as high as 100 parts per million in the work area and 3 parts per million on the highway, 2.5 miles away." Chris Weiss recalled, "That was one of the indications that we were in this thing for a long time." At 6 p.m., the techs took stock of the hectic day. At this time, they wrote, "We are not sure whether I-90 should be opened while Car 3 is being offloaded or if we should wait until after the car is finished." The techs were rehashing that debate despite the threats from today's relatively minor releases. The techs agreed not to work overnight because everyone is getting extremely tired, they noted. By the day's end, Car 2 is down to 70,000 pounds and would be leveled before the remainder was removed. But the spikes weren't finished. Another thunderstorm came around 7:30 p.m. As the evening progressed, chlorine complaints came in from east and west. At 8 p.m., Hazmat simultaneously took reports of 0.1 to 0.6 parts per million readings at Forward Ops and 0.2 to 0.5 parts per million at Roadblock 4 at Fish Creek, 7 miles west. At 10:04 p.m., the Fish Creek Roadblock advised they have a reading of 0.5 parts per million. As residents requested monitoring, Hazmat once again chased chlorine. But there was no log discussion of whether to warn or evacuate these residents. At the next morning's IC briefing, Paul Lazy of the Missoula Rural Fire Department reported that winds caused spiking of chlorine gas release during the evening. Residents were concerned, he said, smelling gas. There were delays in monitoring their location. Off-site monitoring was hit or miss with any significant delay. Then Waldron introduced a new twist. Waldron: "We are dealing with panic response from the public and some from personnel in incident command. The 9-mile area received some crank phone calls last night. Residents received a call to evacuate immediately. A plume of gas was headed in their direction. Please remain calm," Waldron said. Law enforcement advised this is a criminal offense. Waldron said at the next day's IC Plans and Strategy meeting, "The public hysteria needs to be quelled. Monitors are available. The public needs assurance from the health department that everything is okay." Waldron recalled, "We did have regularly, consistently, people concerned or raising issues that were related to their own anxiety, and you deal with those. But while IC alleged prank calls had instigated panic, officials acknowledged part of the panic stemmed from reports of smelling gas during documented spikes." At the next day's evacuee meeting, Sergeant Ball said, "Some self-evacuation occurred last night in the 9-mile area. That is up to the public if they feel they are smelling something and they want to leave the area. Our monitors indicated that there wasn't any problem. Our roadblock to the west during the storm yesterday expanded a bit to Fish Creek." Unified Command gave no other information to evacuees about the afternoon chlorine spikes and readings that had caused the severe fallback. Concerning the evening spikes, there was no mention of reports of chlorine and readings at Fish Creek or east of Petty Creek. The Missoulian only noted officials' reports of pranks in the Houston area, with someone yelling, banging on doors, and frightening people, they wrote. As Ball recalled, there were false reports of a need to evacuate. Ball said of Deputy Howard Reed, "I think he did contact the person that was creating this problem and got it stopped. But was it truly a prank? No, I just think the guy that was out there was wacko. There's a good chance that that person had heard about a chlorine spike and took it upon himself to help us out, like Jim Peters had during officials' neglect of Sawmill Gulch." Out of context, someone's warning to residents was painted as a prank, frightening people for no good reason. But low levels of chlorine had been measured at Fish Creek during the evening, as well as at Forward Ops and Roscoe Road. Reports of chlorine odor came in as well. In the context of repeated chlorine spikes, any concern or warning from a resident seemed logical. It wouldn't be surprising that someone warned neighbors absent any official warning. Gas had indeed breached the exclusion zone. Evacuee meeting reports and the Missoulian gave no documentation of the April 16 chlorine spikes. For all the public knew, it had been an uneventful day. Weiss wasn't surprised if transient concentrations of chlorine or cressolate had been noted away from the site. Did residents who had returned home east of Petty Creek understand that they might occasionally receive more exposures? "I think that was widely known from our public meetings," Weiss said. "I think there were people that came home understanding that very clearly. But the record documented that officials told people visiting and returning that the area was safe and the re-evacuation contingency plan was in case of a big chlorine release. Residents and visitors to the exclusion zone were not told to expect occasional low doses of chlorine or any other chemical exposure. Even low levels could affect sensitized people or asthmatics. With the spike that caused the sear fallback, if prevailing winds had been from the west, the same levels could have hit Petty Creek. Weiss: there were debates about moving the Petty Creek roadblock to 9 Mile, but we were actively monitoring, and if we had to move it, we would have. Yet, he said, it would have been very difficult to notify everybody and in a timely way. And moving forward ops, he said, with all sorts of equipment and tents and trailers and semi-trucks and food service operations, would have been like moving the circus. But this seemed more an argument for proactively moving people back. Though the official stance was that no levels were recorded this night beyond Petty Creek, the logs said otherwise. Some of the crew at the Petty Creek roadblock recalled nights when the chlorine smell was strong and irritating. The readouts from an unnamed fixed monitor this day, likely on I-90, showed a 15-minute short-term exposure limit of 1 parts per million and above was triggered several times between noon and midnight. At this monitor, there were over 20 spike periods, including some lasting over 15 minutes, and the highest peak was 13.5 parts per million. I-90 to the north was a toxic roulette wheel. Weiss recalled, up and down the river there were hits periodically. We saw that at night. We saw chlorine bubbles floating all around. The first day of continuous monitoring near the site revealed an unsettling story, but much more dangerous spikes were yet to come. Chapter 19. Two Fronts. April 17. Work stopped overnight, but the tank belched sporadically into the morning. Residents visited again. At the IC day shift briefing, Dan Watts advised that removal of chlorine from Car 3 would be very complicated. Because rolling Car 3 was too risky, the techs planned to burn the hole with nearby fill dirt, frozen with liquid nitrogen or carbon dioxide. The Chlorine Institute approved the plan, the text said. In effect, bury the rupture. Steam heat would be applied to the other end where liquid had pooled to vaporize the chlorine. A pipe would draw off vapor to an empty chlorine tank from which 2 lines led to vapor compressors, then into 2 caustic cars where the chlorine vapor would be turned into bleach. This process will take 2 to 3 days, Dan Watts said. This is a tried and true procedure. The tech still hadn't seen the rupture. At a noon strategy meeting, Ellen Leahy reported that she had talked to Todd Damrow, director of the State Health Department, about having ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, study the health effects from the spill. ATSDR's plan was to interview approximately 1,200 people about their symptoms directly following the spill. The total included 1,000 evacuated, plus those in a buffer zone around the evacuation area, and also responders. Analyses will be done to determine if there are differences in health effects related to level of exposure, ATSDR said. Later, a determination concerning follow-up of this population for long-term health effects will be conducted, including a possible pulmonary function study. An ambitious set of goals, a full population symptom survey, exposure evaluation, possible long-term health study, and a side look at pets. Leahy helped ATSDR create the health survey, noting they would say, what kind of complaints are you getting? Let's list the classic complaints. You're going to get burning eyes, burning nose, you might get sore throat. What else are you getting? ATSDR flew in 5 staff members to assist with interviews. At the time, ATSDR held that after acute exposure to chlorine, pulmonary function usually returned to normal within a month, though chronic diseases may occur, such as persistent asthma after acute high-dose inhalation of chlorine. As Leahy noted after conferring with ATSDR, later RADS, reactive airways dysfunction syndrome, may develop. Chris Weiss said, you can call it RADS or hypersensitivity response, whatever, but it's essentially the same thing. It's a reactive airway problem. The state and ATSDR were aware of clinical textbook references to chlorine and RADS, noting from a 1994 study, several groups of patients who have survived short-term, uncontrolled, high-level exposures have been followed for periods of 1 year or more. Some had complete recovery of pulmonary function. Some have had a persistence of symptoms and mild abnormalities of pulmonary function over many years of follow-up, including the presence of airway hyperreactivity and symptoms compatible with reactive airways dysfunction syndrome. Years later, Leahy claimed, we knew this type of injury to chlorine gas can be a long-term life-altering injury. But no one believed very many Alberton victims had a high-level exposure. RADS hadn't been addressed in public, and discussion of sensitivity issues had been limited to temporary irritation of skin and eyes. Weiss said that part of the EPA's original intent was to monitor health effects, including hypersensitivity, with the Rocky Mountain Poison Control Center. But ATSDR stepped in, he said, and indicated that they would take over that effort. Weiss had wanted a study to determine what pulmonary function effects might have occurred as a result of the exposure. But ATSDR wouldn't offer any such medical testing until 18 months later. In the aftermath of the spill, ATSDR did nothing beyond a health survey of residents and responders. No testing established a baseline for a long-term study. Unrelated to ATSDR, MRL offered pulmonary function tests later in April to anyone interested, but never made results public. Though ATSDR did not fully assume the role Weiss had envisioned, he was hesitant to criticize the agency. We have long encouraged them to get involved in chemical spills such as Alberton, he said. This is their role, and we were very happy to see them join us out there. Despite talk of RADS, the medical abstraction form sent from ATSDR to the state focused on basic respiratory, dermal, and eye problems, with no mention of sensitivity. ATSDR began a long and controversial role with the Alberton spill. At the April 17 evacuee meeting, Will Snodgrass began videotaping 6 consecutive meetings. In addition to fully documenting, the tapes conveyed the mood, which apparently had been highly critical the previous day. Without elaboration, the Missoulian reported after today's meeting, many participants have used the meetings to voice their fears and speculation that information about the situation was being withheld. Today would bring pushback against discontent and criticism. Waldron told the audience of over 100 people, "What we are doing is in your best interest. The most knowledgeable people have been brought in to help you." He pled for understanding. "We've got almost as many people at the site as there are in this room. We're your friends and neighbors. We live there. Dan Watts was one of the evacuees. It's very difficult to sit up here and listen to some of the things we hear," Waldron said in a cracking voice. Waldron later recalled, "What raised the frustration level more than anything was people wanted to go home, and we did not have and could not provide them a date that they could go home. So I think that's what was the biggest issue there." But an uncertain reentry date had not been a complaint the day before. Residents had voiced concerns over health and exposures. MRL's Watts started today's main agenda by explaining the new plan to convert liquid chlorine to vapor in Car 3, then into bleach, hopefully finished by April 24. Watts: "I got a question yesterday about modeling. Once they knew the size of the tank hole," he said, "we'll have the capability of calculating exactly, based on the weather conditions, what existed that morning, what happened, and what the plume looked like and where it went." Then Missoula pulmonologist Dr. William Beckemeyer addressed respiratory issues. Beckemeyer had seen all 11 patients hospitalized locally. All were doing substantially better, with several discharged. As regards to the individuals who were seen in the ER with less severe inhalation injuries, he said, "I think the statistical odds are that those individuals will have a self-limited, fairly minor illness." There weren't a lot of studies, he said. Those not hospitalized were at fairly low risk for long-term illness. Beckemeyer said local ophthalmologists had seen a few patients with burning eyes, which was treatable and shouldn't cause any long-term consequences. Beckemeyer then took questions. A podium mic was set up at the back of the room. Roger Chalmers calmly said, "It's the long-term stuff that I think we need to talk about." Beckemeyer: "As I said, I can't predict who's going to have long-term consequences. Those that do have long-term effects, it certainly seems to be in the range of 1 to 2%, or even less. From low to moderate level exposures tend to have problems that are asthmatic or bronchitic in their nature. And those individuals may be sensitive to a variety of other irritants in the environment, like asthmatics. As far as more consequential long-term injuries, those seem to be really limited to individuals who for the most part have had heavy exposures and severe acute injuries." Beckmeyer didn't define long-term, but yesterday Weiss said sensitivity would last 6 to 8 weeks at most. The MRL evacuee meeting handout elaborated. Those patients who were not admitted but received care in an emergency room statistically will recover fully and are at low risk for further respiratory problems. People in this low-risk category who had moderate or low exposure to chlorine gas may experience symptoms such as sore throats, irritated eyes, and headaches due to hypersensitivity to chlorine, but this hypersensitivity should fade in 6 to 8 weeks. Low-risk patients are not expected to have any long-term effects from the limited chlorine exposure. Long-term health effects may be seen in the patients who experienced higher exposure to the chlorine gas. The message: unless you were hospitalized because of high exposure, you should recover fully. Activist Tony Tweedale noted in a memo at the time, long-term effects from short-term exposures are practically unstudied, although sensitivity to chlorine and various airway problems have been reported in people for months and years afterwards. Next, Ellen Leahy spoke on evacuee meeting protocol. Leahy reminded people that officials could not answer health questions in a general way, apparently a topic that had come up earlier. She encouraged individuals to speak to doctors concerning health problems. What we try to do with the information that we get from our nurses every day and from our new environmental and health information phone line, she said, is we try to look for themes in the kind of questions. And if we get a theme, we try to bring the answer to you, because it's a question that many of you are asking. What we're going to try in these meetings from here on out is to limit ourselves in the full floor discussions to those kinds of themes, because unfortunately, some of the more specific concerns and information that you may have, either health-wise or environmentally, we're not able to address if we keep this meeting going on too long, and people are milling around trying to get their questions addressed. We're very concerned that the residents get their questions addressed. So that's what we're going to try and do at the end of this meeting, and ever after, if it works out, is, again, to encourage you to speak with the nurses for health concerns. We're going to add another circle of folks that you can go to and speak with, and those will be the folks that are working on environmental monitoring in the area. We'll also ask the EPA toxicologist to join that group. This statement was confusing, but Leahy seemed to say that the panel would only address health question themes during the meeting, topics pre-identified by the panel, and the panel wanted to have more specific questions addressed individually after the meeting, apparently to control the length of the general meeting. Leahy emphasized that she wanted residents' concerns answered first, a reference to activists posing questions. As MRL summarized Leahy, during these meetings we are limiting the questions in the forum. Residents need to ask questions to have their concerns addressed. Personnel are provided at the tables to answer individual questions after the meeting. As the EPA phrased it, public meetings are being restructured to allow for smaller group discussion on specific topics of concern. Unified Command sought to stifle non-evacuees from asking questions or making statements in the name of giving preference to evacuees. At the same time, evacuees were limited from asking specific questions during the public forum. But limiting who could ask questions, the number of questions, and types of questions by the whole group had the net result of less sharing of information and more fostering of distrust. Leahy later explained that officials wanted to get control over meetings. There was really concern, she said. Will Snodgrass was standing up and saying all sorts of things and asking all sorts of questions. And the residents would sometimes come up to us after, and they wanted their questions answered, but they felt like their forum was not theirs anymore. Weiss concurred. And so, he said, the normal approach that we use is to break up into small groups so that everybody can be heard. Snodgrass's participation seemed an excuse. The standard solution was enacting time limits. If someone had a question that many others would likely share an interest in, such as, why does it smell? Why am I having reactions during visits? It seemed more effective and efficient to have it addressed openly and communicated broadly, rather than catch as catch can individually. Yeah, Weiss agreed, it's much easier for us to communicate it to a large group, which I think was done. And the other way, of course, is through the news media and television, flyers, etc. But this meeting sent a clear message. Open questions were limited during the group forum. Snodgrass wasn't surprised. That's the sequestration that's designed into most meetings today, to prevent one person from saying something that is useful to the rest of the crowd. It's designed to stifle communication and to put a lid on potential liability, Snodgrass said. For Waldron, the main issue was time. You know, he said, you could go to those meetings and spend 6 hours and not transfer any more real information than you can in 1 hour. I think the purpose of, after so many days, there's just no way to continue to manage and rehash the same questions. So what we attempted to do was to bring in experts that could answer their specific questions. And that's why we went into the, I can't answer that, we'll break up into groups. It wasn't an attempt to keep information away from people or reduce that opportunity. The adversarial folks, you have to live with them, manage them, and oftentimes you learn something from them as well. It's all about time management, I think, is the main issue we were dealing with. Leahy next announced a request for ATSTR to get a better sense, population-wise, of what kind of effects you have experienced, she said. And from that data, we can even ask questions that we might want to try and answer in the future. This big project would require interviews with every one of you and all of the emergency personnel, she said. This was the first mention to evacuees of ATSTR's health survey. Leahy then addressed low-level chlorine exposure broadly, a late-coming response to some residents' concerns. Leahy: I think one of the more generic questions we've been asked, to give you an everyday household point of reference, there was in-the-field testing today that was done. And actually what was done is put some bleach in the normal amount you would use when you're adding bleach to the laundry and put it in the washer, and we measured at the top of the washer. And the ranges that we found were 0.3, that's 0.3 parts per million, to 0.5 parts per million. Now, as a point of reference, the most sensitive nose can begin to smell this at 0.3. Leahy added, and then they went out to the YMCA, and they went about a foot above the water level of the swimming pool, and they got 0.1 part per million. And we know the OSHA standard for an 8-hour exposure is 0.5. These low levels were common, at least in the modern era of chlorine, but 0.5 parts per million typically produced irritation and coughing, and OSHA standards were for healthy adults. Even household bleach, of course, was a hazardous chemical. But this field test also implied that evacuees with newfound sensitivity had been having reactions to about 0.1 parts per million in swimming pools. Such common levels could cause health problems for sensitized people. Weiss recalled, we weren't trying to placate anybody, only give them a frame of reference. And the other thing that we were trying to do is caution people that might have had a hypersensitivity reaction or reactive airways disease or reactive airway disorder to be aware that if they're going to run a load of whites and they dump a cup or two of bleach in the washing machine, they may have a reaction. So it was both precautionary and to give people a frame of reference. Weiss's point about hypersensitivity was important, but any such precautionary advisory was not reflected in Leahy's report to evacuees. When Q&A began, the facilitator reminded, the more complicated health issues will probably be best directed to Ellen Leahy's panel of nurses and other experts after the meeting. The newly limited Q&A session began with a defense of the panel in apparent reaction to yesterday's criticism. A woman rose to acknowledge the fire crews from Frenchtown and Alberton and received loud applause. She continued, I want to express my appreciation to MRL and the people from MRL. You have anticipated our every need. You've met them, and I am for one very grateful. She clapped, immediately joined by loud applause. Another woman identified herself as a teacher. I want to let Scott Waldron know that the opinion of a few is not the opinion of the rest of us. Someone shouted, right, followed by big applause. Steve of Alberton added, I have to commend MRL, the way they've taken care of us, the services they've been offering, and the questions they've been answering. Thank you very much. Another big ovation. Another woman spoke. I think one of the things that's bothered me recently, there are outside agendas creeping into this. I saw the ad from the attorney in Minnesota, I believe, in the paper the other day, that if we want to talk to somebody, we can do so. Frankly, I have a lot of trust in what has been going on so far, and I really don't want to show a lot of my interest elsewhere. I think you, MRL, have more than compensated us for our losses at this point, and I appreciate what has been done. The people with outside agendas of a commercial nature, I would personally prefer that they talk to us outside the meetings, instead of bringing their commercialism into the meetings. Because we have direct interest here. If these people are directly involved with this, that's one thing. but I really don't care to hear all this side to it. I don't know how other people feel, but this is how I feel." More big applause followed. No lawyer had pitched anyone during the meetings, nor would have been allowed to. This woman appeared to lump non-evacuees who had spoken out, such as local activists, with lawyers that had advertised in the media, implying activists too had a commercial agenda. Following these statements, the facilitator asked for any questions, but none came, and people were reminded to visit the small groups. The partisan emotion in the room today was likely intimidating to those with questions. But the evacuee meeting minutes summarized that toward the end of the meeting, someone asked, "Question, the off-gassing coming out of the ground, is that what the smell is? Should we be concerned?" There was no logged response. There was no audible question on the videotape. Perhaps this person spoke up in proximity to the panel and was told to go to a group. As such, this muted question symbolized the diminished voice of those residents still seeking open answers, and the growing split within the community. Today's open Q&A session saw no health or environmental questions addressed, and had mainly served as a booster for the panel, with sustained partisan applause not discouraged. A split was clear among evacuees. The April 16 meeting established that many residents were concerned about health and safety issues and distrustful of the information presented. They had lots of questions. The April 17 meeting had other residents, to broad applause, expressing strong support for MRL and responders while criticizing the critics. Public questions had been discouraged by officials, and today they heard few. Hope Seek characterized, "They stopped the question and answer period. They said, 'We don't have time for this. We need to get through our agenda.' The majority of meeting attendees approved." At 2 p.m., the techs began transfer of Car 4. Soon after, a fixed monitor at the site spiked at 92 parts per million. Marine monitors noticed sustained high readings throughout the afternoon, with a peak of 128 parts per million, the highest documented spike so far. In the reopened area east of Petty Creek, Missoula Hazmat recorded 5 positive readings between 4 and 5 p.m., ranging from 0.1 to 0.4 parts per million. At 6 p.m., the techs reported that Car 4 flowed very slowly and would take some 30 hours to empty. They considered raising the pressure 15%. One possible theory on why this car was covered with ice originally, they said, is it probably had chlorine spilled all over it during the derailment. Car 4 lay in the south ditch. If chlorine from Car 3 had spilled all over it, the chlorine likewise would have spilled into the Crest Lake pool. There was no accounting for the day's spikes, which continued overnight as Car 4 was transferred. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, we conclude Chapter 19, Two Fronts. While the techs struggled to transfer liquid chlorine, leaving the leaking Car 3 for last, the highest chlorine spike so far erupts, over 1,000 parts per million. Meanwhile, officials struggle to address residents' health and safety concerns amid growing discontent. Till then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.